Total War Warhammer 40k might have just quietly revealed way more gameplay systems than people realized during the PC gaming show trailer, because after going through the footage, frame by frame, and extracting all these unit cards and UI elements, there's actually a ridiculous amount of information hidden in plain sight. Now, the more you stare at this stuff, the more it feels like Creative Assembly isn't just making Total War with bolt guns. They actually seem to be reworking core Total War systems so that they actually fit how warfare works in Warhammer 40k settings. And now some of these mechanics actually look really clever. Starting with the unit cards themselves though, there is a surprising amount going on despite how clean and readable they really look. At first glance, they almost seem pretty simplified, but once you compare multiple cards side by side, you start noticing patterns everywhere. You've got armor classes split into light, medium and heavy, and then unit categories like infantry, elite infantry, vehicles, and command units layered on top. The Ogrins, for example, are medium elite infantry, flash gits are light elite infantry, battle wagons are heavy vehicles, and the Baneblade is a super heavy tank. So immediately, the game is clearly communicating battlefield roles visually before you even look at the stats. Speaking of which, we have got a stat representation showing firepower effectiveness versus different armor types at the bottom of each unit card, using the same shapes repeated throughout the UI for light, medium, and heavy targets. So instead of needing to memorize armor penetration numbers or obscure damage types, you can pretty instantly tell what the unit is going to be good against. For example, it looks like the Baneblade will pretty much shred, well, funnily enough, most targets, but clearly with a focus on light and medium targets. Guardsmen seem decent against light infantry, but weak into armor, and flash gits appear much stronger against medium class targets. It's basically a quick battlefield readability system, which makes a ton of sense for a game on this scale, because when you're managing dozens of units in real time, you need that information incredibly quickly. You can't just spend 5 seconds hovering over every unit trying to figure out what counters what. But at the same time, the cards have an expand button, and so these are probably the streamlined battlefield cards, while the expanded menu likely contains all the proper detailed stats underneath. Probably things like armor penetration, suppression values, reload speed, accuracy, morale modifiers, movement speed maybe, and all the crunchy Total War numbers that people love digging into. Speaking of morale though, I think we may have figured out what those little +5 and +7 numbers actually are. At first glance, it could be easy to think that they are some kind of veterancy level or maybe some kind of buff, but after comparing the Baneblade screenshots side by side, it really looks like some kind of morale, command cohesion, or battlefield momentum system. Because in one screenshot, the Baneblade has a negative value of -1, and then later in the battle, it's sitting at +5, showing very different stats. So I suspect that these numbers are tied to battlefield momentum or morale swings happening dynamically during combat. And then we have an icon of an eye. Now this thing shows up all over the UI, and I'm leaning towards it being some kind of visibility or detection mechanic. I mean, after all, that's what eyes usually symbolize. It could be stealth, maybe potentially hidden units, potentially battlefield awareness, or some kind of spotting range. Anyway, considering the trailer heavily focuses on cover and terrain usage, it would fit pretty well to those kind of mechanics. Anyway, the little communication looking icon though, that one is a lot harder to pin down. Now my best guess is that it's tied to Astra Militarum command systems in some way, maybe some kind of battlefield coordination or reinforcement communication. So the game repeatedly references strategic reserves, and we can clearly see some army numbers like 20/40, and at first we might assume that's some kind of population cap, but when you compare it to the visible army roster, there are actually 20 deployed units on battlefields at that moment. And so this means that 20 out of 40 could literally represent 20 deployed units out of a total 40 unit army. And if that's true, well, it suggests that battles are not fought with your entire army deployed from the start. Instead, units may arrive dynamically throughout the battle from a reserve pool, potentially from orbiting fleet ships, potentially through dropships, potentially through faction-specific deployment mechanics, which of course would be unbelievably fitting for Warhammer 40k. Now, Astra Militarum could reinforce constantly with waves of infantry, Orcs could flood the battlefield harder and harder as they build up momentum, Space Marines might field fewer units overall, but deploy elite reinforcements through drop pods and Thunderhawks. Eldar could potentially warp units around the map through webway mechanics. And so suddenly, faction identity becomes way more asymmetric and lore accurate. What is interesting though is whether there will be a cost to bringing down reinforcements. Honestly, I'm not too sure, and I couldn't really find much information about that apart from some of these symbols here. What they mean though is anyone's guess. What is interesting as well is that instead of every faction just being balanced around equal army sizes, factions could play completely differently based on reserve flexibility and reinforcement style mid-battle too. This of course also ties into the strange favor bar at the top of the battlefield. Initially, I thought the bar could be showing the proportion of deployed units versus those in reserve, for example, with the solid sections representing the reserve units and the striped sections representing currently deployed battlefield strength. But the reason why I think this now can't actually be the case is because we see in the trailer points where the solid bar is the same size for different reserve numbers of 20 and 16. And if we were to reverse it all to say that the solid sections represent the deployed units and the striped sections representing the reserve units, well, we see striped sections reducing in size even when the reserve unit number remains at 20. Because of all of that, I now think that the top bar is a battlefield control or some kind of momentum system rather than simple army balance of power. And the solid versus line sections seem to indicate different states of control over maybe some kind of objective. The solid colored sections appear to represent secured control or confirmed score progress, while the striped segmented overlays likely show temporary momentum, active capture pressure, or projected gains, some kind of incoming control influence rather than locked progress. I'm of course not 100% sure, but I'm sure someone in the comment section below might make it clearer. My best guess though is that the system works something like this. The solid color equals banked victory control or secured territory. The lined or striped color represents current capture pressure being applied in real time. Maybe it's all about fitting the Total War style territory mechanics and mixing it with a kind of Dawn of War or Company of Heroes battlefield capture system. It could also explain why the battlefield footage constantly focuses on advancing lanes and holding ground. The maps seem designed around pushing fronts forward rather than annihilating every enemy unit. Of course, this is all conjecture, but that's what we love to do. Anyways, it's clear that we are not just grinding down a single deployed army, and what's pretty cool is that we'll be managing reinforcement timing, battlefield momentum, and reserve commitment throughout the fight. Now, another thing that really stands out from the trailer is how important cover mechanics seem to be. Infantry aren't standing around in perfectly rigid rectangles, firing at each other. In fact, we actually got to see units spread out naturally through the ruins and terrain taking cover. And the bonuses from cover look pretty massive too, where in the trailer it literally shows infantry under cover are harder to hit with projectiles, and then underneath that it actually says, well, 20% ranged resistance, 45% evasion, and 100% suppression resist. Suppression especially seems incredibly important here because it looks like heavy weapons probably aren't just about raw damage anymore. It seems like maybe they will pin enemy units down and disrupt movement, which creates a battlefield dynamic that honestly feels closer to Dawn of War or Company of Heroes layered onto Total War scale warfare. And then there is the really cool little detail with the battle wagon. One tooltip says cover speed reduction high, which suggests of course that terrain physically impacts vehicle movement in meaningful ways. Driving massive tanks through rubble and dense cover looks like it will slow them down significantly so that terrain isn't just visual flavor, In fact, battlefield positioning and mobility looks genuinely important depending on the unit type. Now, outside the battles themselves, the campaign map screenshots are also packed with interesting stuff. After enhancing the images, several UI elements became much clearer. We can read things like Decima Vigil, Tarot, Main Army, and Battle Group Oxus. Immediately, a few things jump out. First of all, Battle Group Oxus is fascinating because it strongly suggests armies are organized into battle groups rather than individual generals. The campaign map itself also looks system-based, where you can see the orbital rings around planets and moons, plus a huge dotted outer boundary around the entire theater, which potentially, by the way, means that campaign theaters function like miniature solar systems. And then there's the Tarot tab, which is still kind of one of the weirdest things in the entire UI, because in 40k, Tarot is, I guess, tied somewhat to prophecy, fate, and psychic interpretation, and I guess maybe this could potentially be a campaign modifier system, narrative mechanic, some sort of strategic doctrine system, or even some kind of faction-wide buff mechanic. The fact that it has its own dedicated menu, though, suggests it's a pretty major feature, but I'm just not really too sure what it is. I'm sure someone, though, in the comments section below may have some ideas. Overall, the deeper you dig into the trailer, the more ambitious this whole project starts to feel, and what's absolutely awesome is that Total War Warhammer 40k might end up feeling pretty different from any Total War game that we've played before. Not just visually, but mechanically too. It really does feel like Creative Assembly is trying to build warfare systems that actually fit the scale and chaos of 40k, rather than simply reskinning historical mechanics with bolters and chainswords. Let me know what you think of the reveal so far in the comment section below. There's still a bunch of UI elements and mechanics that I genuinely can't fully figure out yet, especially the Tarot system, the communication symbols, and even to some extent the objective or favor bar at the top of the screen. I'm sure many of you guys will also probably spot details that I completely missed, and so do let me know about them below. If you enjoyed the video, as always, make sure you give it a thumbs up. I'll definitely be digging through more footage and developer interviews as more information starts coming out about Total War Warhammer 40k, but until then, take care and see you next time.